Benjamin, do you know if we're waiting for anyone else to join?
I don't believe so. John just got on a bit ago, so
Great.
should be good.
John, you get to kick us off with a welcome if you're ready. You're muted.
I'm muted. Hey everyone, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us for this third meeting. I know we have a lot to cover. I know you've covered a lot, and I know we got you some sort of last minute materials. This process has been a little bit of getting things together on a very short notice. So we appreciate your patience with that. And I am just going to let you know that I have to leave at 5:00 on the dot, be picked up and taken somewhere else. So hopefully we can conclude this in 2 hours. So with that, Elaine, I believe the agenda is yours to start.
Great. And Benjamin, if you could bring up the PDF. And I may not have sent it to you. I sent it to Darren and to John. While one of them is forwarding it to you, I'll just go through the agenda. So the agenda is to talk about the financial forecast, and Nick Popenook, who teams with me on all things tax increment financing, is here to help us walk through that. And then a project priority discussion in reference to financial capability. Some members wanted to go back to the diversity, equity, inclusion discussion that we had last week. Then we've had some committee questions from past meetings, so we'd like to go through those. And then have question and input from the committee and see if there is any kind of recommendation that committee feels comfortable making, which might include another meeting if that's what you think is best, and then any public input, and then to adjourn. So should I go into my email and try to send that to Benjamin, or did John or Darren, were you able to send it on to him?
Ben, do you have that? It looks like you were copied on the email from Darren.
I recently received that, yes.
Yeah.
Could you put it on the screen, please?
Absolutely. Hold on one moment.
And then you'll need to, when I ask you to go to the next page, to help advance for me, please.
Of course. Hold on one moment.
And again, an apology for getting the materials late. We have actually been working on those since the last meeting. There's a lot to do when you're looking at the financials, because what we, this is not the right screen. We have to try to manage projects and expectations on cost of projects with financial capability. And that takes a lot of give and take between the city and us, and having just a week to do that has been challenging, but we were able to get a good copy, I think, of some information to share with you today that we know does need to be refined with your input. So it's what we would call a draft of that input. And I'm going to keep going through some of this while they figure out how to get that on the screen. So as we have talked about at the last meeting, our TIF forecast, which is actually done by Nick and his group, includes an assessed value growth of, excuse me, 5%. So that's 3% appreciation from existing assessed value and 2% from new development. And that equals between about 6.8 million and 7.5 million in new construction per year, and a duration of 30 years. One of the questions that we did receive that is pertinent to deal with now, I believe, while we're waiting, is Jim had talked about, Jim Edwards, whether or not that forecast was aggressive enough. And Nick and I have talked about that, and I've asked Nick to talk a little bit about how he does forecasting and what the assumptions were in this forecast um, to help you understand how we do the forecasting and get your further input as we walk through. So Benjamin, if you can move this down to the page that's titled TIF forecast. There we go. And Nick, would you like to talk about the assumptions a little bit?
Sure, thanks, Elaine. Good afternoon, everyone. Some of you I've worked with before, but others, I think this is our first time meeting. I've worked with Elaine and others on urban renewal and property tax forecasting in various Western states for the last couple of decades. And whenever we're looking at a large geographic area and trying to forecast increases in property values over the next 30 years, there's always going to be a lot of uncertainty in that process. This is particularly true when it's an area that is blighted, like an urban renewal area is intended to be, and has gone years without any significant development happening, and might have a tremendous amount of development potential, but has never seen that potential unlocked in the past. And some new public investments are going to be needed to make that development take place. It can also be even more challenging in areas where there's currently one set of zoning, but that in the future the zoning may change and allow different types of development to occur. When we are working on these development forecasts, we try to balance being conservative and aggressive. If we are too aggressive in the forecasts that go into a tax increment or an urban renewal plan, then we are setting the city's expectations and the community's expectations that a very large amount of funding can be generated here to pay for a lot of exciting public projects in the near future. And if those projections turn out not to come true, then you have a whole lot of disappointed community members wondering 5, 10, 15 years from now why they weren't able to see the types of projects and investments that were promised to them in the urban renewal plan that was adopted in the past. We saw a whole lot of plans like that that were approved sort of at the turn of the century in the early 2000s when the real estate market was really hot. Everyone thought things were going to be going up exponentially forever. Urban renewal plans were adopted by communities that were predicting they'd have 7, 8, 9, 10% growth per year sustained long term. And instead, they hit a recession, property values dropped, new construction slowed down, and the actual revenues that were received fell far behind what was projected. And those communities were left scrambling to change their plans and come up with other sources of funding and dial back those expectations for how long it's going to take these projects to get built. On the other hand, if you are too conservative in your initial forecasts, the urban renewal plan has to say that it is financially feasible. So we have to take a look at the projected growth in the area, how much tax revenue that's reasonably forecast to create over the next 10, 20, 30 years, whatever your desired time frame is. And that's how we back into what the maximum indebtedness of the area is. And that maximum indebtedness is a statutorily required limiting factor. And so once you set the maximum indebtedness in your plan, it is challenging to amend it in the future to increase that dollar amount. So you have the risk of being too conservative up front, setting a maximum indebtedness that's a little humble, and then you wind up having gangbuster growth in the area, far more growth than you had originally anticipated, and you're not quite able to capitalize on it because you've already set the limit for how much this urban renewal area can fund. So those are the two sort of competing sides here that we're trying to walk a tightrope between. I will say that, Elaine and I have done over 100 of these plans, maybe getting closer to 200 now these days. And we have seen a heck of a lot more communities that have been too aggressive compared to communities that have been too conservative when it comes to setting up their plans. If you are too conservative, it's also a little bit easier to mitigate for that because you do have the ability to increase your maximum indebtedness in the future. There's limits on it, but those limits can also be exceeded if you go out and work with the affected taxing districts and get them to agree that it's an important amendment to the plan to increase that maximum indebtedness. And if your area is more successful than you plan on it, you may not be able to fund more projects than you originally put in the list, but you can fund them sooner than you expected. And that means you can pay off the debt sooner and close down the urban renewal plan sooner, and you just accelerate everything. And that's great for the overlapping taxing districts who now receive the growth in tax revenue sooner. Or if you do truly believe that there's still more projects, 20 years from now that could and should be funded here, you could always go back and create a new urban renewal area and start this process over again. So that's kind of the big picture framework that we're looking at here. For the specific numbers that we used for this urban renewal forecast, we chose 5% for a few reasons. One, we looked at a previous study that had been done by Echo Northwest, and I assisted on that previous study, though I wasn't the lead author. And they had some really detailed growth projections for a number of scenarios of estimating what might happen in a boundary that looked pretty similar to the boundary we're looking at today. And when we looked at those growth rate scenarios, really the moderate growth rate scenario that they looked at in the past was pretty similar to the 5% growth that we're talking about here. We also looked county-wide at what long-term growth rates had been in the county. And again, it's similar to 5%. And so that's saying that, this area might be receiving its fair share of county growth long-term with the forecast rate that we're showing here. Whereas in the past, this area has been growing much slower than that, as it hasn't been seeing that new construction occur. And then as this slide is showing, what does the 5% growth actually mean in terms of the amount of construction activity that would need to take place here? And in order to sustain 5% growth in this area over the next 30 years that this forecast period covers, it would require an average of $7.5 million of new construction activity every year through good years and bad in order to achieve that. And again, when you look at what's been going on in the community, $7.5 million of new construction each and every year is certainly substantially more than this area has experienced in the past. Though I can understand folks looking at the overall development potential here and saying, boy, I really feel like if we could truly unlock this area's potential, it could be even higher than that. Over the 30-year period, that does add up to around $240 million of total new construction value here. And that's in today's dollars. That's not counting inflation that's going to occur in the future. So ultimately, that's how we came up with the numbers in this report. Again, they aren't guaranteed. They aren't set in stone. We know from our own experience that there's going to be years of higher growth and there's going to be recessions and years of slower growth. But on average, this 5% growth rate felt reasonable, certainly predicting that the area is going to be experiencing more growth than it has in the past, getting its fair share of the county growth, but trying not to be overly optimistic and setting expectations too high and planning on having more funding here than may be actually realized over this planning period. So I'll pause there for any comments or questions or discussion on the growth rates used in the analysis.
I see Jim Edwards has a question.
Well, I was wondering, Nick, if to what extent you consider the fact that this is such a unique location. It's the second largest waterfall by volume in the United States, and I think it's one of two, or the only one that's in an urban growth boundary.
Yeah, it's I have done work on the falls in the past, and it truly is a spectacular natural monument landmark here that you have. And so it's truly something that is special. The challenge is that on this project, we do not have property owners developers, architects that are coming with us to say, these are the specific projects we want to build here. These are the footprints. These are the pro formas. This is the development timeline that we're going to have. I saw in some of the materials that have been emailed around comparisons to the Vancouver waterfront. And Elaine and I worked with the Port of Vancouver earlier this year to adopt the first urban renewal plan in the state of Washington that's focused on the Vancouver waterfront. For them, they did have leases negotiated with all of the property owners within their urban renewal area boundary. And those leases told them exactly how big the buildings were, what year those buildings were going to be completed, what the estimated construction costs were. And so we were able to factor that information in to have a much more detailed forecast of the growth in assessed value. And in that particular area, it did show a much higher than 5% growth per year. They were going from basically bare land to hundreds of millions of dollars of new construction over a period of just the next 5 to 10 years. So a dramatic transformation is definitely possible. It is challenging, again, for just the financial consultants in the absence of having clear deals made and deals negotiated and contracts signed that are committing to these kind of construction investments, for us to go out and estimate how much we think the new construction activity is going to be in this area. So, without those construction agreements already finalized, there is still an awful lot of uncertainty about how soon new construction could take place here, and in the early years, how much value that new construction is going to add, and then for how long will that new construction be sustained for? What will be the ups and downs of economic cycles in this area as that construction occurs? So I think you're absolutely right that this is a special place and that the potential is here for substantial amounts of new construction. That, my question really is, what strong evidence and documentation do we have that we can rely upon to make sure that we aren't being overly aggressive and setting the community up to be disappointed if this construction doesn't materialize on that anticipated timeline? Is it Kevin that has a hand up now as well?
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and I really appreciate your input. So one tool I think that will help us understand the size, as I understand it, is soon to be released from the city. They're going to put out an RFP for a waterfront master plan development exercise. I don't know the scope. I don't know the whole detail, but I believe that's going to try and plan the waterfront area in a way that would give some more clarity to it. I will say that's not something you can bank on. That's not developers. And we've all seen our share of books that have massed out high rises, right? But anyway, that's just one piece that is an interesting clue. But I want to actually then ask is a couple of relief valves. If we were to agree to the current forecast and 5% rate, you said the ability to increase indebtedness, that there's a mechanism maybe for that. Is there a limit on that? How does that work? And then secondly, or go for a new TIF. Is that like if it was really a new developer or developer showing up going, guess what? I'm putting $200 million worth of new construction here in the next 5 years, and it's 5 years from now. What's the mechanism? What do those two mechanisms look like?
Yeah, I'll turn that over to Elaine to address those more procedural questions.
So any existing urban renewal area may increase its maximum indebtedness by 20% of the original maximum indebtedness as increased annually by inflation. So to get to that number, and it's the inflation rate used in the report on the plan. So you take your original maximum indebtedness, increase it every year by that inflation rate, and then you take 20% of that. The Urban Renewal Agency has the capacity to do that increase on their own, but through a substantial amendment process that does involve public participation like what we're doing now, and the full process of notifying taxing districts, going through consult and confer process, and having another citywide council hearing. So it is a fairly in-depth process to increase it, but you may do that. You may increase it over that amount if you have approval of 75% of the taxing districts who represent 75% of the total levy. So we have done that in some other communities where the projects that the Urban Renewal Agency wanted to do were significant enough that the other taxing districts agreed that it was a good idea to make that increase and did vote by resolution of their boards to do that increase. So those are those provision. The other provision, Nick and I talked about this a little bit because I wanted to be sure to address Mr. Edwards' prior concern and the concern that he followed up with in the email is if this area is really successful and it meets its maximum indebtedness earlier, it can close down as another alternative. And maybe there are portions of the area that haven't developed, and that area could either be in a much smaller, Nick and I have done single property urban renewal TIF areas. You could do that also with just like multiple properties. So if there was a large development that was happening that included the need for infrastructure or public amenities, and this is very similar to what the Port of Vancouver did, the taxes off of just that specific development could pay for those specific either infrastructure project or amenity projects. So you couldn't do that while it was in the entire urban renewal area. But if the city and the agency got to the point where they saw development was going to drastically exceed expectations on the existing urban renewal plan, they could finish out that plan, shut it down, return that value to the taxing districts, and then if there were other needed improvements, figure out a way to either set up a new area for those improvements or do a single property or a 3 or 4 property urban renewal area to address that.
Thank you.
Were there other questions at this time on that, or we can move through? Nick's and his team has done quite a bit of work on the financials that we'd like to share with you. So why don't we continue with that? Thank you. So Nick, do you want to go through this slide?
Yeah, sure, I can I can do that. So when we summarize our financial capacity, I'm not sure if folks have seen a similar chart like this one before, but we kind of look at it from a few different lenses. So we're looking at and assuming this area would be in existence for 30 years, and over that time frame, we estimate that it would generate $89 million of TIF revenue, the actual property tax revenue that be received by the area. But that money is in nominal future dollars, and a dollar 20, 30 years from now is not going to have the same purchasing power as a dollar today. Additionally, the area is estimated to incur debt over the life of the plan, and that means that some of those tax dollars are going to need to be paying interest on that debt. And so that also reduces the amount that you can actually spend on projects in terms of the capital costs. So that next row on the table there, the maximum indebtedness, that is showing the actual amount of principal indebtedness on projects we anticipate the area would be able to spend. The difference between the total amount of TIF in the first row and the maximum indebtedness in the second row is the estimated amount of interest that we paid on debt. There are certainly some urban renewal areas that choose not to incur formal debt, and they're able to spend every penny of their TIF revenue directly on projects. But in doing so, you have to wait longer to be able to fund those projects, which means more inflation occurs, which means your purchasing power also is reduced. So there's not one right or wrong answer, but generally, if you're trying to fund large capital projects and you know inflation is going to be problematic, incurring debt to help expedite those projects early on can be particularly helpful. Our analysis also is using fairly conservative estimates for those borrowings. We're assuming that the public debt here would have to be paying 5% interest per year, which is a little bit above where we currently are. And we currently are in the highest interest rate market that we've been in the last 20 years. So hopefully if things go down in the future in terms of interest rates, you would be able to do a better job of leveraging your maximum indebtedness and not have to spend quite so much of your TIF revenue on that. The capacity, the third road there in 2022 dollars, that's just taking the maximum indebtedness number and adjusting it for inflation. And again, a lot of these dollars come in the back end of the urban renewal area 20, 30 years from now when the purchasing power is much lower. And so when we account for inflation, we adjust that 75 million back down to roughly $42 million. That's the amount of money you'd have available to spend on projects in today's dollars. And then those subsequent rows on the chart are showing estimates of when that capacity would be available in sort of 5-year chunks over time. And you can see in the first 5 years of this district, there would be relatively little funding. It's got low value today. Construction takes a while to get underway. And then there's a delay between when construction happens and when that increase in value actually comes onto the tax rolls. And then you have to wait until you've generated enough revenue that you can go out and borrow a significant chunk of money to be able to start investing in these projects. So we show relatively little capacity in the first 5 years, but then we show really between $7 to $10 million of capacity to fund projects every 5 years after that, as you go out and sell bonds to fund a large amount of capital projects, wait another 5 years or so for your annual cash flow to increase, and then sell more bonds and just repeat that process. So the next slide, this gets into the actual projects that we have assumed will be funded here. Elaine, I might turn it back to you, or maybe even to Darren, to talk about the projects and what was assumed. I will say as the top line here, that when we're showing these projects, we've got the total costs of them estimated here, but we're assuming that the urban renewal area would fund roughly 50% of these costs, that it would sort of be a local matching fund, but that there would need to still be other funding sources made available to also contribute to these projects. So Elaine or Darren, want to comment on the projects that we assumed in this model?
I can start, Darren, and then you can jump in and correct me if I'm off the mark. So we had asked the city to look at, after our discussions with you last week, and to look at the overall list of projects they had and put them into priority order. So what we received back are some priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3 projects. And like Nick says, on here from number 1 to 11, these are the estimated amounts for those projects overall. And then when Nick and Ali on his team transfer those into the finance plan, they used half of that amount just so that we could keep a greater number of projects within the plan, knowing that we may have to adjust that in the future, depending on where you can get grants and where you can get matching funding. On the administration, that full amount, the 650, is in the finance plan total. So this is a subtotal of these projects of $41.2 million. And again, we funded half of most of those except the administration. Next page, please. These were the priority 2 projects. On these, the biggest component is the historic Willamette parking at $8 million. And again, we put in the finance plan funding 50% of those. Next page.
Oh.
Question? Oh. And then priority 3 projects, this was the information from the city. And of course, the biggest one here is that riverfront park project. And again, it's at 50%. So what Nick did from the information from the city was then put this together with the information from when they thought they could issue debt to show how these projects might be funded. Next page, please. So this just shows when those loans might happen, and at, like Nick said, at a 5% conservative interest rate, and what the loan terms are. And you can see as you go out further within the area, that final loan term is only 6 years. When Nick and I work on tax increment plans, we like to estimate that the area is done completely within the time frame that we talk about. Some plans that were written prior to plans that we did would talk about ending projects, and everybody would hear 30 years, but the financing would really end up going 40 years. And we just have felt that the message needs to be clear about how much money is being spent for however long. So these end at that end of the 30-year time frame. Mr. Edwards?
Yeah, last week, John Williams mentioned a potential parking garage or parking facility in Willamette, but I don't see on your list any parking facility anywhere in the TIF area. Can you address
So
that?
yeah, go. So on priority 2, it's number 4 there, historic Willamette parking, and then go back to one more page. On this one, there is parking, historic city. I should have walked through these, and I'm sorry that I didn't. Historic City Hall parking is listed there. So 2 different parking. So let me just quickly go through this. So Willamette Falls Drive, phase 1 and phase 2, Candler Street realignment, 8th Street connection and improvements, Riverfront Trail, Historic City Hall parking, Historic City Hall Public Plaza, facade improvement programs, streetscape beautification, Riverfront Trail amenities, and then administration. And then these Willamette Falls Drive, 12th Street, and then 14th Street, improvements there, and then 10th Street and Blankenship Road, and then the historic Willamette parking. Next slide. And then Riverfront River Fishing Dock Ladder, and then the Riverfront Park. So let's move forward. Oh, okay, there's the timing. Let's move forward to the next slide, please. I'm sorry that this is a little hard to read, and I can give you the full numbers. It's really hard in PowerPoint to put all this information into a slide. I'm going to stop there and go back because I see a question from Cassandra.
Thank you, Elaine. So just reflecting back on a comment that you made specific to the duration of the plan and the, Elaine had mentioned that a plan can say it's 30 years, but really it's a function of the debt and the repayment of that debt. And so for us as an overlapping taxing district, it's not over till it's over, until it closes down and that debt is retired. And so our revenue is frozen for decades until that plan is retired. And so I appreciate you pointing that out, Elaine, just because that's where it gets a really difficult for us to financially plan for the future when we're foregoing millions of dollars. And so we would be interested in, and Elaine has heard this from other discussions with other cities, in ensuring that there is a plan duration provision in this, so that as an overlapping taxing district that will forego, quite a bit of revenue. Looks like the total is, almost $11 million of revenue that we aren't able to use for, paying for firefighters and operating fire stations. We'd really want to make sure that we had some certainty about when this plan would end, so that if this does end up coming to fruition and this is something that's becomes an actual plan that's adopted, we would really prefer that has an end limit in it, so that we can plan accordingly for the future.
And for those who don't know, the statute does not require a duration, an end limit. It does require that maximum indebtedness number that Nick referred to on an earlier slide. However, a lot of times taxing districts, and especially the fire districts, are very active in looking at urban renewal tax increment plans, have asked for duration provisions. And that is a decision by the city council when they adopt the plan on whether they want to put that in or not. A number of the plans that we've worked on recently with TVFNR have included that duration provision at the request of TVFNR. Cassandra, you want to follow up there?
Yeah, the only thing I wanted to point out for the group is that unlike cities and counties and school districts that are made whole, property tax revenue is our only source of revenue. And so when you have a tax increment financing plan, such as the one being proposed here, that really carves into our bottom line because that's our only source of revenue. We don't have system development charges or other things to kind of offset that impact.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, just given the amount of money that will actually be available for projects, I think, $42 million, it looks like the likelihood of the TIF being able to fund a waterfront park is pretty slight. Would that be a correct assumption?
No, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but when Nick and Ally have worked this out on the finance plan, we're actually able to fund that 50% of all of those projects within the 30-year time frame.
Okay.
Yeah, I will say that as currently planned, it is being listed as a priority 3 project, or the other more tangible sort of infrastructure projects ahead of it. And that means that it might not get funded for 25 years under this model. If you have a 30-year urban renewal plan, you really have to be prepared for some of those projects to not be funded until year 25 or year 30. So just keep in mind that we do look like we have financial capacity to fund half of all of the projects that were listed there, but this is a long-term funding plan.
Great. Thank you.
Mr. Metlin?
Yeah, so looking at this chart, we think of it as foregone revenue, but is there a delta between, so if it's TVFNR has 11 million, that represents the increase in value due to development. Is there a delta where we could see what the revenue would have been if there was no development that was spurred by doing the tax district? So my question is, it's probably not actually 11 million. It's 11 million because we're developing, and so there's an increase in value. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah,
And that,
it is. It gets into the weeds because by developing the area, you are now creating additional, residents and businesses that need to be served by the fire district and by the other taxing districts. So even though this revenue might not have existed without the investment of the urban renewal area, that doesn't mean that these foregone revenues aren't truly, being foregone by those other jurisdictions who would need those funds to provide the desired level of service here. So, Elaine and I have been doing this a long time, and I'm trying to understand the nuanced, detailed, true impacts to any individual taxing district is particularly challenging and relies on a host of assumptions. We show these total foregone impacts because they are the largest possible number that we can show here, and we want to be as transparent as possible to the impacted taxing districts. And this just shows for every single dollar of tax revenue that the area is going to receive, that's $1 of tax revenue that one of these taxing districts is not receiving. So our foregone revenues add up to the same dollar amount as our total amount of tax revenue. But you're absolutely right that the true financial impacts are a bit murkier and a bit more nuanced. But we have Cassandra here, and she can certainly tell you that the cost to serve these areas is real, and they are truly foregone revenues to them.
Yeah, thank you for that.
The only other thing I would add, Joel, is that we would get a 3% guaranteed per year if nothing happens, that we don't get. So that also is a little bit kind of nuanced, but.
And I can't see everybody. I can see Mr. Schwartz has his hand up. And then if there's anybody else, somebody who can see all the people should let us know. But Mr. Schwartz?
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. Yeah, I actually put my hand back up on the capacity summary slide. I had a question about that.
Sure. Can
Um,
we go back to that? I'm sorry, you weren't on my slide and I just figured out how to scroll through and I found you.
That's okay.
There we go.
So the question I had was in the last two chunks of 5-year periods, the capacity drops. And I was curious why that happens as opposed to would have thought it might just continue to increase.
Yeah, the sweet spot for the most capacity happens to be around the midpoint of the district because your revenues are still growing fast. You don't have that much previous indebtedness incurred that's tying up your annual cash flow with debt service payments, and you still have enough lifespan left in the area that you can issue 20-year bonds to really, maximize the amount of funding you're getting now while obligating future years' tax revenue to pay for it. When you get towards the end of the life of the district, you already have a lot of debt obligations you've taken on. So a lot of your annual cash flow is already spoken for. And the bonds that you're issuing, or the bank loans, whatever debt you're taking on at that point in time, is going to be limited in duration. You're not going to be taking on another 20-year borrowing when you know that the intent of the district is to close it down in 5 or 10 more years. So that's the reason why you start to see more constraints on the capacity in those later years. The amount of debt you've already incurred, and then the limited duration you have to amortize those costs over a longer time frame.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, back to the impacts to taxing districts. Thank you. So as discussed, these include both the 3% and the additional 2% of potential new growth. And so the impacts overall for the city of West Linn are, and these numbers are not going to be exact to if we move ahead with a plan. They're going to be very ballpark and close to that. But as Nick adjusts the finance plan, that ripples through the entire spreadsheet and numbers change little bits. But these will be very close to what those end numbers are going to be. So City of West Linn itself, about $15 million, Clackamas County, 17 million, County Extension, 355,000, County Library, 2.8 million, County Soil and Conservation, 355,000, TVFNR, 10.85 million, Port of Portland, around 500,000. Metro, 686,000, vector control, 46,000. So these are all what's called the general government taxing districts. Mr. Edwards?
I just wondered if the development substantially exceeds the assessed value. My understanding is that excess would still accrue to the local taxing districts. Is that correct?
No.
So revenue sharing is the one thing that I would bring up here. So this is our estimate of how much tax revenue would be generated in each year, and all that revenue would be foregone from these districts as shown here. If the actual tax revenue turns out to be lower, then these impacts are lower. And if the actual revenue is higher, then these impacts are higher. So, really, it depends on the actual timing and the amount of new investment that occurs in the area. If there is very substantial new development beyond what we have anticipated, there is in the statutes revenue sharing or an under levy. And that says that once the annual tax revenues for an urban renewal area exceed 10% of that area's maximum indebtedness. So our maximum indebtedness here is what, 75 million? And so if the annual tax revenues were ever above 7.5 million, then you would start to have to be required to share a good portion of the excess above that point with the overlapping taxing districts. But anything below that $7.5 million threshold on an annual basis is going to go to this urban renewal area. So if you did have faster growth than we were anticipating, you would not see the other taxing districts start to get some more money sooner. What you would see is that you'd be able to get more revenue for the urban renewal area, so that you'd be able to fund the project sooner, incur the debt sooner, and pay the debt off sooner, so that you could close everything down, and you then could fund the full amount of this in 25 years instead of 30 years. With the one caveat that if you ever do get above that 7.5 million per year, that 10% of your maximum indebtedness, that's when you actually do start to see some sharing with the overlapping taxing districts. And while we're on the wonky subject of revenue sharing, I will say that there are other districts that are out there, Wilsonville being one of the more prominent ones, that got late into the life of its urban renewal area, had accomplished all the projects that it really wanted to, or most of them, and then they chose to voluntarily under levy. They said, you know what, we're doing really good, better than expected. We don't need to collect the full amount of revenue we're bringing in every year. Let's go ahead and limit our collections to 5 million a year. And we'll allow the excess on top of that to go to the overlapping taxing districts. So that's certainly an option that's available to you, and not something that has to be decided up front, but can be decided every year during the budgeting process.
Mr. Schwartz?
Thank you, Elaine. This topic is, for me, one of the critical reasons why I have my doubts about a TIF in the first place. I don't like taking tax revenue from other entities and potentially starving them of needed tax revenue. TVF&R is certainly one. The city of West Linn is another one. In fact, I had asked Mr. Williams if we could have the finance director from the city on this meeting today, because I wanted to hear her opinion. I serve on the budget committee, and I kind of wanted to hear her opinion about this loss of future tax revenues and how that might affect the city budgeting process, because I do have some real concerns about that. So I think that was more of a statement than a question, but I would like to know if perhaps the finance director would be able to join us today, or if perhaps Mr. Williams has a comment about this.
Ed, thank you for that, and thank you for giving us the heads up. Unfortunately, Lauren was not able to join us today, but I did talk to her a little bit about this. And I think I agree what you just said was more of a comment than a question. These numbers, and as you can look at the foregone revenue on this chart, are obviously a very, very small part of our tax revenues right now. If our efforts are successful to develop the area with infrastructure so that some development happens, it could represent significant reductions over time. I think that's, as I mentioned at previous meetings of this group, I think that's the power of having the tax increment finance agency be the same 5 people that's your mayor and city council. And that is so that they can look at this district, look at the work that it's doing, look at the impact it's having on our own finances, and certainly on the finances of other districts, and make decisions about how we administer it moving forward. I guess one way of answering this question is, another way, I guess, is that the council, after reviewing all of this several times in a number of meetings, gave us direction to get to this stage. And so they are interested in, I think, sacrificing a relatively small amount of city tax revenue in order to stimulate realization of a vision for this section of West Linn. So I think this page gives you as much ability as you can have to make a recommendation to council about what impacts might be. Again, I just underlined the point that at the beginning it's a pretty small amount, but you look at the year 2040. If the city of West Linn is losing over $400,000 a year at that point, that's the equivalent of a couple of FTE. When you look at salaries and you look at benefits and the overhead, so it's not a massive loss. And if the council continues to think that it makes sense to do that, I think it's an equation that could work out well for the community. Ed, you weren't at our last meeting, but I think it was at the last meeting that I said that the answers to questions like this is exactly why your group exists. The council is looking for community-wide input about whether this is a good
Looks like we've got one more hand up. Pat?
Yeah, Elaine, of course, and I appreciate Cassandra giving me a quick lesson last meeting on the impact. The one question that I was able to drill down on a little deeper, I might need your help on. We, of course, on a kind of regular basis, do a local option for, and it funds about 80 teachers annually. And I know it gets really complex and deep into the weeds when we start talking about compression. But is that a knowable number that would reduce our ability or our capacity under the local option?
So since I have Nick here and he's the finance compression guru, I'm going to throw this to Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. So the short answer is that the new urban renewal areas don't have any negative impact on local option levies for school districts. And so you wouldn't, when we go to the next tab or the next slide here on the PowerPoint, and we show the foregone revenue to education taxing districts, you can see the school districts listed there, but that's only the permanent rate levy. So you'll have foregone revenues from your permanent rate levy, though your actual funding amount that the school district receives is still going to be determined by the state legislature with their per capita amount or the per pupil amount with offsetting amount of funds from the state school fund. So when we're looking at the local option levy, we have found that in areas where they are suffering compression losses, the creation of urban renewal areas can wind up having a small but beneficial impact to school district local option levies. The mechanics of that are that because we are this urban renewal area is created and it is now its own taxing district and it's a general government taxing district and it receives its tax revenue by slightly reducing the tax rates for all other taxing districts, including the community college, the education service district, and the school district. We're seeing some of those education tax rates be reduced, and that money gets now treated as on the general government side of the ledger. And because compression is calculated separately for general government as it is for education, by reducing those tax rates on education, you've now given yourself a little bit more capacity for how much tax you can impose before you're suffering compression. And since local option levies are the first type of taxes to have to suffer any compression, they wind up being the ones that really experience the volatility when it comes to these things. All that being said, we don't have a specific number for you. Compression losses are notoriously difficult to calculate because they aren't, let's say your local option levy lost 10% of its collections due to compression last year. It's not 10% across the board. It's a whole lot of properties that aren't experiencing any compression and a few properties that are experiencing 20, 25%. And it really depends on the individual characteristics of each of those properties and how their individual real market values versus assessed values are going to change over the next 30 years. So I have done these kind of forecasts before. They're really challenging to do. And honestly, they've cost more to forecast that than the entirety of all the rest of the work we've done on this project so far. But rest assured that the big picture headline for the school district is that your local option levy will not be negatively impacted by urban renewal, and it could benefit in some small ways, but probably not big enough of an issue to worry about trying to quantify.
Nick, I almost tracked all of that. So the detail, I think I got it. And just the last follow-up, same true for general obligation bonds?
Yes.
Yeah, general obligation bonds are not impacted by urban renewal. However, they do not have the same minor positive benefit that local option levies have. They truly are not impacted in any way.
Okay, I appreciate the detail. Thank you. And Cassandra's going to help me out once again. I can see this.
I just wanted to affirm for what Nick is saying about the difficulty in those compression calculations, because we ask the assessors' offices of the 4 counties that we serve on a fairly regular basis if they can help us understand compression to check our math when we do our projections for potential compression loss. And they don't even have it because it's calculated on a lot by lot basis. And it's such a moving target depending upon the classification of that, et cetera. So I'm chuckling only because when Nick says it's too time consuming to do, and he is the biggest brain in this realm that I know of, it's not easy.
Thank you, Cassandra.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, I looking at these figures, I was just curious about the rationale for the annual increases. So why is it, for example, the Clackamas Community College goes up from 9,000 to 14,000 to 19,000 to 25,000? Like it's clearly more than inflation. It's clearly more than 5%. So what's the rationale?
Yeah, so what we're looking at here is that the fact that our total assessed value is going up at 5% per year means that the increment assessed value in the area is going up at a much faster percent per year.
Okay.
So you start off with $100 million of assessed value, and it goes up to 105 million the next year, and then 110 million the year after that. So you had this 5% growth overall, but from the urban renewal area's increment perspective, it went from $0 to $5 million to $10 million. So it had, from year 1 to year 2, it had 100% increase in its increment value, even though the total value is only going up 5%. And that's what we're seeing here. And so you'll see the percent growth on these on the tax increment revenue, and the percent growth on the foregone revenues is pretty high in the early years, and then starts to mellow out long term. And that's just because you're just measuring the very tip of the total assessed value in the area, as that total assessed value grows up by 5% per year.
Okay, thank you.
Nick, can you see any other hands up? I don't see any.
I think we're good.
Okay, next page, please. So this would be changing focus a little bit, and maybe before that, we should go back to the priority 1, 2, and 3 projects and see if there is any input from this group on changing any of those projects from 1 to 2 to 3. What happens if we change them is priority 1 projects would get funded first. Priority 2 projects get funded after priority 1 projects are funded, and priority 3 get funded at the tail end of the district. So this is the way presently Nick has laid them out in the finance plan. But if there's input here that's different, the city, I'm sure, would be interested in hearing that.
And Elaine, on this point, I just want to reiterate for folks that this is all about setting expectations. That the finance plan in the urban renewal plan and report, when it comes to the specific dollar amount allocated to any project and the specific timing of when that project will be funded, those assumptions are non-binding. They are only there to set expectations and for us to be able to show that, yes, this is a financially feasible scenario. What's binding is the total list of projects. So making sure that everything that you want funded within reason is included on the project list, and then the total dollar amount for the maximum indebtedness for the plan. Those are the binding elements of the equation. The timing and the amount of funding for individual projects is non-binding, but certainly helpful for guiding the future actions of the city as they try to administer this plan in the future.
So does anyone feel that anything that's in a priority one here should be moved later? And in terms of priority one, we have funded them pretty much in this order.
Elaine, I would feel comfortable talking to members of the Bolton Neighborhood Association and bringing this up to some other people instead of just making a off the cuff decision. There's a lot of meat here, and I feel like it's gonna just be nice to sit down with this and come back to it.
Right, that's a really good point. And we can also put this in a little different framework to show, like the Willamette Falls Drive improvements phase 2 is later than phase 1. And so I think that's a really good input, and maybe some input here from folks would be, do we fund all of Willamette Falls Drive's phase 1 and 2 before anything else, which basically means we don't do much of anything for the first, I don't know, Nick, how many is it, 15 years before we get to do anything else unless you split them out in phases. And I guess from the city, it would be great to hear that too. Mr. Woody, do you have more comment there?
Oh, no, sorry, I'll put my hand down. Thank you.
Elaine, this is Ed Schwartz. I've got my hand up. I don't know if you can see me this time.
I can now.
Okay, thank you. Actually, first off, Mr. Woody, I think makes an excellent point. In addition to being on the budget committee, I happen to be the president of Savannah Oaks Neighborhood Association. And I think it would be great to discuss some of these projects with, for several neighborhood associations to discuss these project lists with their members and get some feedback on that. And then secondly, I'm really surprised to see the Chandler Street realignment be the third project in priority one. My neighborhood association abuts the property that would run through. And I know that my neighborhood association, Savannah Oaks, and also the Willamette Neighborhood Association have had numerous discussions with the property owner regarding where this street would be realigned. And they have been unfruitful, I think, to say the least. So to have that such a high priority surprises me quite a bit. I would think that should be moved down the list, or probably should be moved to priority 2 or 3. But
That's
anyway,
good.
that's
But
my.
right now, it looks like that wouldn't, I mean, this is all very changeable, but in the finance plan right now, that shows potentially being funded in fiscal year in 2031. So not an imminent project at all, but I hear your comment. Mr. Smith?
Thank you.
Yeah, I was just curious to learn from the city, which of these projects seem most related to the riverfront development?
Sorry, do you mean the waterfront development?
Excuse me, the waterfront development, yeah. So
That's a tough one, but I would say Willamette Falls Drive is going to be because the waterfront is the envisionment, right? So that's everything from McLean House up to the water treatment plant.
uh-huh.
So wouldn't it be with Willamette Falls? That would be the primary.
And then I'm assuming historic City Hall parking, historic City Hall public plaza, the riverfront trail amenities, the riverfront trail would all be kind of related to that as well.
Yeah, Greg, this is Darren.
Okay.
That's correct. Yeah. So the 2 phases, I can't remember which one is which. I believe Willamette Falls Drive phase 1 is from 10th Street to Sunset.
Yeah.
And then phase 2 is Sunset to the proposed roundabout.
Right.
So the both of those would be critical to redevelopment of that area down there. And then, of course, the potential parking structure if one is needed, and an amenity as the public plaza and the trail. Again, those are all components of what we've heard from the community engagement so far in the waterfront outreach.
I was really struck last week with Jim's ideas about development up on the hill overlooking the river. And I'm wondering to what extent these kinds of improvements would really facilitate that.
Well, yeah, so the roundabout and the realignment of the street will be critical. I know Kevin on this call represents the property owner there, so he might be able to weigh in a little more. But yeah, so some of the improvements around the transportation down there will be critical to redevelopment of the area.
Yeah, I'm glad to weigh in on that. So I do represent the Belgravia ownership group of that area, and I'm an architect, and I've been doing some initial planning for them. And there is a really important mesh of all this together. That Willamette Falls Drive, what is ultimately the TSP, the new alignment that goes through that site. It's a real chicken and the egg. You can't do the development without the road. You can't do the road without the development. Almost, they really kind of all work together. So the city hall, which, as many on the call know, has no property other than just its four walls. So parking and things and plazas and things that go with that is also an important kind of dovetailing there. That's kind of a part of all this, is to see kind of the efficiency of building a lot of these things at the same time that touch each other. So you're not starting a construction project and then coming back years later, a few years later, and putting up the barricades again. So I think I'm pretty sure there's a marriage of a lot of these together where they touch each other.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Edwards?
Well, it might be an appropriate time to talk about Greg's comments about the mill. My feeling is we're talking about a long-term plan, 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know what the time period is, but eventually, as an example, I worked with the Blue Heron Mill in 2009, and I had an agreement with them at that time. And then they suddenly declared bankruptcy. And I think the West Linn paper mill closed subsequently to that time. And so ultimately those mills, well, the only functioning mill is ultimately going to close. So I think we need to, as a community, look at a long-term plan for that property.
Darren, do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, so as part of the next phase of the waterfront project, that will be a component of it. It's a very complex situation. The property is actually owned by PGE and not the mill, so that complicates it. Access to the property is very limited, so there's a lot of complicated factors involved with it. But yes, getting to some kind of resolution about what the future of that property would be nice.
Ms. Carson?
I know that having gone through several of these plans, the plans around the waterfront over the years, I'm very concerned about making an assumption that the mill is going to close, especially since we don't have anyone from the mill here at this meeting. And so I know that the mill doesn't have any plans on closing. Of course, that doesn't mean that they won't. So I think making assumptions that will close isn't really a valid thing to do at this point. And also, I think what Darren said is really critical, is since the island is all owned by PGE, PGE is going through a 106 process in terms of the Mill A part of the island. They have not had any interest in developing anything on the island just because of access and some other things. I think that making assumptions that something is going to happen on the island, which would either be both the mill and the Sullivan plant and the other unused space on the island, really would be difficult to make assumptions for what's going to be built down there. I think talking about the upland properties and the area that's going to be impacted by some of the changes in traffic and potential development on those sites makes a lot more sense. I do think that the priorities here with having the Willamette Falls Drive improvements and the, parking plaza and the parking for Historic City Hall and the trail improvements all make a lot of sense because those all really tie together. And there's a lot of things that can be done with those particular areas. So it's good to see them clumped in priority one.
Chief Olvin. Muted.
Thank you. I wanted to echo what Jody was saying and what Jim had submitted in writing. I mistakenly thought more master planning had occurred in that area. And as we've observed other tax increment financing plans and funding strategies, usually there's already been a lot of that groundwork and reference back to those master planning processes. So it does seem like we're really rushing towards something when there are many unknowns. So I just wanted to convey that publicly.
Okay, I can only see Mr. Edwards up. If there's somebody who hasn't spoken and somebody else sees that hand, otherwise, Mr. Edwards.
Okay, I'm going to hesitate to see if anybody else steps in ahead of me. The only comment I have is that that the opportunity to reuse some of the mill construction, that's existed there for 70, 80 years. It seems like the planning process would give some consideration to the opportunity to reuse that without regard to how long the mill might operate, but kind of facing the fact that wouldn't be perpetual, and at some point that the mill would stop, and that Portland General Electric might offer that property to someone to reuse in some fashion. And I don't have a vested interest in that. I'm 75 years old. Whatever happens to that mill and the property is going to be well past my lifetime. So I'm really looking at this as something that would benefit the citizens of West Linn as well as the citizens of the state of Oregon.
Darren or John, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Excuse me, I don't really. I think this is a great discussion. In our initial work on the waterfront visioning a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, what we heard from the community was essentially what you just heard from this group. The mill is our only manufacturing business in West Linn. It's an honored business. It's been part of the community for these many years. And we don't want to chase it away. In fact, we want to help it exist because there's jobs in there that we don't have any other place that we provide them in this community. So it's important. Nevertheless, mills all over the Northwest and all over the nation have been closing, and we've seen it happen. So we'd be crazy to think that it'll never happen. So I think there's a middle ground, which you just heard a little bit of, which is thinking that in the very long term, there may be something different that happens on that island. Will it happen in the next 5 years? I kind of doubt it. Would it take 20 years to figure out how to redevelop it if the mill did close? If they closed tomorrow, it would be a long, long time before we could figure out how you would reuse that island and whether there would really be development there at all. Because some folks are talking about that it would become go back to green space and be a part and be a place that honors the native tradition. So there's just so many options that it kind of blew our mind a couple of years ago. And I suspect as we restart the waterfront project that it'll be very, very similar. So it seems to me that including it in the district, but not expecting too much is probably a reasonable middle ground. Now, what does too much mean? I don't know. And Darren, you may have more thoughts, but again, and I hate to answer every question this way, but again, I think this group of smart minds and community members, you know as much or more as about what might happen in this community as I do. So we very much value this conversation, and anything that you can advise the council on about how to address this would be very much appreciated.
I see Mr. Holquist. Unmute, please.
The island, I see, you know, some challenges with development with the dam being there, and that's, you know, that property and how do you secure that and all that. But above there, I think that's where all the improvements will lay the groundwork for down the road in the event that there's opportunity on the island to develop it. So the phase 1 and phase 2 improvements, I would think would be you know, above the island, you know, around the old city hall and along the redirected roadway roundabout. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't see any hands up. Okay, Mr. Edwards?
Well, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I tend to be a glass half full kind of guy. And I've done a number of projects that, and the illustration that I shared with all of you is 100% goal. And a lot of times in my projects, and I've been doing this for 40 years, I only attain half. And a lot of times I don't attain that. I get involved for 5 or 10 years, and then the project runs on for 30 years. But it only attains half of what the initial expectations were. And so I just have to admit to the committee that I'm an optimist, and it doesn't have to reach all my expectations, but I'm encouraging the committee to think a little more broadly and think in terms of maybe attaining half of my expectations.
John, can you see if there are any other questions? You don't see any? So I didn't see, other than Mr. Schwartz.
And just went up from Kevin John.
Yeah.
Okay.
Elaine, I'm sorry, but can I ask one other question? I am torn, and I think where Cassandra was going is a little where my heart is too, is that I really wish this TIF was happening after the master plan process. And I just want to ask, what would be the issue with delaying this TIF program? Let's say it's a year, whatever. And Darren, you may know the most of kind of your timeline of the master planning. I know a lot of that will be a lot of talk around the potential, but it would be a lot more clarity of kind of what the opportunity for the developments are in the area. If I'm tracking what I think this waterfront development RFP is going to go for. Any comment on that?
Yeah, so thanks, Kevin. So John and I did have this conversation with Elaine and Nick when this project started about sort of the chicken and the egg conversation.
Yeah.
Right. And so where we landed as city staff was that any changes that get made through the waterfront planning process will not significantly change what the outcome on the properties would be. Right. So it's not all of a sudden going to go from being general commercial to something that's going to generate a whole lot of different outcomes. Right. So general commercial right now, you can do first floor retail, apartments above it. So we don't anticipate that the outcome of the waterfront planning process will be significantly different than that. A lot of the area is zoned industrial. A lot of it's not developable whatsoever just because of the slopes and the resource constraints on it. So we felt comfortable going forward without the plan being in place, knowing that the outcome of the plan would not be significantly different than the zoning that's in place right now. If that makes sense, Kevin.
Okay.
I think the other part of that is these projects are still going to need to be done. And so identifying them as a project and identifying a potential partial funding source just helps move those conversations along to know that potentially this can be done and that there is an identified funding source for part of it. But you're right, we had long discussions about when and how you move forward with this.
Thank you, Lynn.
I'd like to.
I do think the projects are in alignment with what I think is going to be coming.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'd really like to emphasize that point. The reason the council has asked us to move forward now is because we have heard consistently that these projects are probably going to exist in any form of the visioning that happens. Willamette Falls Drive, for example, is never going to go away. It's going to need to be improved to provide local access, no matter what that access is to. It already needs to be improved, but no development is going to happen along Willamette Falls Drive without it being better. We know there's going to be a riverfront trail. We know we need parking in additional areas. And I think the council's logic here was understanding the way TIF works, that it takes time to build up, that the sooner that we can start capturing it, the sooner we can deliver the community vision. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a great argument for putting it on hold and developing the vision and perfecting it and putting the zoning in place and knowing exactly what there's going to be and then creating this. It really just puts the realization of that on hold. So I'll skip my usual speech about that's what we're asking you to do. No, I just did it. But I think, you know, if there's a preponderance of this group that thinks it's a bad idea, knowing what we know to move forward right now, that's critical information for the council to have.
And while you're thinking about that, let's look at projects priority 2 and just see whether anybody thinks those are in the wrong place and need to be moved up or moved down. So it's Willamette Falls Drive, 12th Street, Willamette Falls Drive, 14th Street, 10th Street, Blankenship Road, and historic Willamette parking.
Ed has his hand up, Elaine.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Elaine. Going back to what Mr. Williams just said, I am coming to the conclusion that perhaps we're putting the cart before the horse by working on this project before we have fully developed, or at least more fully developed, the waterfront project. You know, some of the comments we've had already from TVF&R, from the school district, concerning the uncertainty in future revenue shortfalls, I think shows that maybe we're a little bit ahead of the game here by trying to address this project at this time. So just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Carson?
Yes, I guess I really want to talk to the other side of that. I do think this is the time to go ahead and do the TIF, because many of these projects need to be done so that we can actually have some of the development. I mean, I think there are several things that can happen that aren't going to change with the vision for the waterfront. Once the street improvements are happening along Willamette Falls Drive, some of the other things are going to improve traffic flow, are going to benefit any of the future projects that may happen down at the waterfront, but they're also going to benefit all along Willamette Falls Drive, the Willamette area, and the area immediately across the highway in that little triangle-shaped piece of property. Those things are currently developable, and there are plans already for at least a couple things going forward that if this gets put into place, the revenues from those projects in terms of the beginning to get the funding for the TIF, those projects will help fund that. So I think it's important to go ahead and do it now. We know these particular projects, the priority ones and the priority twos, are really going to be important and vital for the area. And they're not going to depend on what is the final outcome of the visioning process, because we've had a lot of talks about visioning, and I would agree with what John Williams and Darren have said, that there's not going to be something that's so different than the existing zoning. And there's certainly a lot of other things along Willamette Falls Drive that can be started before then.
Thank you. Darren, can you see any other hands?
Yeah, hey, it's Melissa from PGE chiming in here. And my day job's economic development, so in general, support TIF zones as I've seen how successful they can be. One thing that Nick said that's kind of sticking is the uncertainty of any development agreements in place to move forward, like in Vancouver, where that was so successful. And PGE being one of those property owners, and I know it's been frustrating that we don't have a plan, and Jody nailed it. We don't have any plans to develop. We have a substation that we plan to continue operating. So these are things to consider, and I don't know if a year will change certainty there or not. I know a lot of people higher than me are having conversations, continue to have conversations probably with you, John, and others about what we plan to do. But I don't know if there's been conversation with the other property owner. We want to be a good partner and are hopeful, and hopefully that will be what we'll do, but it's uncertain, and just wanted to note that.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to speak on that at this time?
Yeah, Elaine, you've got a Jim and Michael.
Okay, let's go in the, Michael hasn't talked yet, so let's let Michael and then come back to Jim.
I just wanted to share my 2 cents on the issue regarding timing. I would tend to align with Jody's comments. I think this is a complicated, multifaceted issue with development in this area, and so you're kind of trying to figure which end of the string we're pulling on of a little bit of a knot, and I think if we don't start the process, perhaps there are folks who are in this conversation who are going to be having the same conversation in 5 or 10 years, and that's my concern with or maybe what motivates me to think that moving forward with the TIF, with some of these projects that we know are going to be required regardless of the development that occurs, could be a prudent path at this time.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
Well, this may be inconsistent with my vote last week, but I want to support Jody's position because I think it is important to get the tax increment district started as soon as we can, and with some funding associated with immediate projects. And I do want to respond a little, at least a little, to Melissa's comment, and that my vision, which I've offered up to everybody, has not precluded the idea that Portland General Electric continues to generate electricity from their facility, no matter what development occurs there. And so I just want to go on record as taking that position.
Michael, did you forget to take your hand down, or do you have more to say?
I forgot to take my hand down. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else? Yes, I see you looking to, Benjamin, to get us to priority 3. And then just a consideration here also, we have Riverfront Park at the end. I know, in everybody's heart, they'd like to see the park there right now, but in terms of encouraging other development, it kind of ends up moving towards the end. Is there input that that's not the place that it should be, or input about moving that at all? Cassandra, do I call you deputy chief?
No, that would actually be a
I know you
promotion.
probably heard
Oh, I don't mind
Thank
calling
you.
you that.
So my only thought on that is, what would the zoning be around that riverfront park? Would that be nestled in an area where we would be seeing commerce or other developable interests that invite, like you had mentioned before,
Right.
that, it's one thing to say, well, we'll have lunch in West Linn after we go to the park. It's another thing to have it nestled in and zoned proximally to do that, the way that Vancouver
Right.
waterfront did, where you definitely see businesses wanting to be there, particularly the restaurants, et cetera, because of the environment. So I'm not discouraging it from being on a priority 3 list. It's just a thought.
Yep. Darren, do you have a response for that?
I don't. Maybe John Williams knows, but my assumption is this is the park underneath the I-205 bridge. I don't see anywhere along the riverfront stretch between Willamette Park and the mill where there would be another opportunity for a large scale riverfront park. So that was my assumption. It was the area under 205, but I don't know that for sure. We can check on that.
Okay.
That might change my opinion then about it. If it isn't proximal to any other things and it's just a park out there, I think that's more appropriate for a park bond.
Okay, yeah,
Versus-
so we can check on that, Cassandra.
Mr. Smith?
Yeah, as I was thinking about the park, I was just remembering the conversations that took place 8 or 9 years ago when the ponds became available to the city through WES. And that task force really recommended that the area where the ponds are become a park. And that was like our first recommendation to the city. And as I think about the kinds of things that Jim was talking about with regard to potentially having apartments below I-205, being able to provide that kind of amenity along the riverfront to people who lived in multifamily housing would be an incredible draw. And it actually reminded me of development that occurred in a Brazilian city, Curitiba, where a waterfront area experienced regular flooding, and it all ended up being zoned turned into a park with residences around it for folks who had lived in that floodplain before. And so I think there's a lot of sense in terms of kind of imagining the park being an amenity for potentially more intensive housing on the slopes above it.
And when I read from the master plan, it doesn't say location. It says acquire property and transform into regional park to potentially include, a bunch of amenities. So it doesn't, I don't know for sure where that is. So we'll have to hear back from the city. Mr. Bernard?
I think, thank you, Elaine. I think Cassandra's comment is extremely important. If the purpose of these funds is investment to generate additional assessed value, the projects really need to be focused on things that are going to do that. And so this isn't so much a comment about the location of the park, but I think I think it would be valuable to include in guidance to council that whatever projects are funded, one of the criteria for them should be that they are going to increase the assessed value of the surrounding property, and certainly making sure it's an amenity for commercial or residential development would meet that criteria. If it's a local park or something that isn't going to attract development, it probably doesn't seem like the right project for the TIF to fund.
Thank you. Mr. Edwards?
I just wanted to add an example of the importance of a public park in the example of the Vancouver waterfront, where the developer who owned all the frontage gave that to the city in exchange for the city improving that as a park, and it really made the entire development. And so I just want to point that out as an example, and encourage everyone to look at that website to see what occurred up there, and that in a different application, because the geography is a lot different at Willamette Falls, but to see what the creation of a waterfront park did for that development, and encourage that idea at on the Willamette River.
Yeah, and that same concept held through on the part that Nick and I worked on with the Port of Vancouver, where that amenity along the riverfront was really what the people who were doing the private development said, if you do that, we will do this. So that was important to them in terms of their desire to invest in that area, was the fact that that amenity was being developed. I cannot tell if there are other hands up here. Sandra says no.
Elaine, this is Kevin. I can jump in. I just to piggyback on it. I think there's two really solid things with the parks and elements, and one is that value. There's no question. I work with Homer Williams and Gary Nealon when they put the parks into the Pearl District. They were every other block because all the properties around them gained so much value looking down on a park rather than one continuous one. And the other thing I think that's really important is I think there strongly is an equity element that goes with parks. There are people that's where they go for their entertainment, for their break. And so as we talk about equity in the community, that's a huge amenity to a lot of a broad spectrum of our cultural friends.
Thank you. That's a good point. I think, John Williams, I can't see you. Should we, how do you want to deal with a question? And we've kind of gone around this, but before we move forward, I don't know if we need to call a question and see input on whether it makes sense to move ahead now or not. I think we've heard different opinions from different people, and I don't know if this is the right time to get a feel for the entire committee or not.
Well, Elaine, first of all, sorry, I had to skip out for a second and I'm back now. I understand the Riverfront Park question was raised. That park is the park that is down in the stretch along the ponds. And I just came in and understand that some folks have been advocating for park as part of the sort of tourism economic development package, the visitor package of the whole area. And I think that is our intention. As I mentioned at the last meeting, the city has ownership of essentially zero. So working on all of this would require working with the private landholders in this entire area. We've talked in previous meetings about the natural resource values down there. There's areas that'll probably never be redeveloped as such, but could be certainly improved, turned into amenities. The concept of having access to 2 miles of a riverfront on the Willamette River within an urban growth boundary area is pretty powerful, and I think is definitely a draw, especially if you link in views to the water, to the falls, to the Arch Bridge, to the Kanema, all of that. So I think that's the vision. The high price is due to the, you know, property acquisition, to the amount of work that would be required to get people down there and all of that. We'd be happy to provide some more information, but it really is a concept at this point. So going back to our earlier conversation about what exactly we know and what we don't know, just for that. In terms of moving forward, you know, we'd sort of originally scoped this out as maybe 3 meetings, and I think you can see we've gotten through most of it and had a rich conversation and allowed a lot of questions. I did hear earlier in the meeting some requests to be able to take what you now know back to your groups that you're representing and come back to one more meeting with sort of a final viewpoint. And if there's more than, you know, 1 or 2 folks that want to do that, I want to respect the timeline for that and allow you to do it. And it probably wouldn't be that you would be able to do it in the next 3 days and then have another meeting next Tuesday. That would be my guess. So we're probably looking at pushing a meeting out. Maybe the next meeting would be farther out. I'd love to hear from people about that. There may be sort of some backflow valves we could do right now to get a sense of the group. But Elaine, this is the great thing about not sitting at a table right next to you and being able to plan. So we just do it in front of everyone.
Right.
There is a timeline part to this where if we're able to make a decision by the end of the council's able to make a decision by the calendar year, the tax base gets frozen as of a certain point. But we certainly want to be able to say that you all had the opportunity to get all your questions answered, talk to your groups, and fairly represent what those folks want. So I'd be happy to hear from the group what you think you need and how we can get you to be voting on all of the issues that we would send to council in a way that gives you the confidence that you've had time to think it through.
So let's talk first about taking it back to community groups. And I think we have 3 or 4 community group representatives. So if you would chime in on that and maybe tell us when those meetings are, so we would get an idea of how that might happen.
See, Michael and Ed have hands up, and now Tanner. So maybe in that order.
I didn't. I don't have my hand up.
Ah.
I just took it down. I would comment though that for at least the economic development group, we would need 3 weeks because we only meet once a month. So we would need to meet in 3 weeks from today in order to get feedback from that group if we wanted to have that feedback.
Great. So Ed, I'll just go down in the order that I see everyone.
Sure. Thank you, John. So yeah, again, president of Savannah Oaks Neighborhood Association. I also happen to be the chair of all the neighborhood association presidents. And I certainly think public input, the more we get, the better. So my request would be that we have the opportunity to bring this to the neighborhood associations, most of which meet once per month. Again, yeah, we'd probably be pushing off our next meeting for at least 3 weeks and maybe 4 weeks. But that would give all the neighborhood presidents in West Linn a chance to discuss this topic with their members, go down the list of projects, prioritize those, and give us some, I think, valuable feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. So my neighborhood, the Bolton neighborhood, is meeting this evening. I've got a few other plans going on. I should be able to attend, but it's going to be weird. I can try. If it's not this evening, we're also once a month, so that's bad news for timelines. But we work very well asynchronously with email. So maybe just set a deadline and we can get the people who are interested together and then start putting up a proposition for everyone else.
I see Brad and then Greg, and Ed, your hand is still up, so you can go third if that hand isn't just left up. Brad?
Hi. Our group, I'm president of Historic Willamette Main Street, and we have a design meeting this Thursday. Our next board meeting is in several weeks, but this Thursday, good opportunity to bring that up with a good part of our group and get some feedback.
And I was just going to say that the Willamette Neighborhood Association meets on, the next time will be October 12th. So I could report back and get input then if that's what we decide to do.
So, Elaine, unless you have any major timeline concerns about that, it sounds like if we were to schedule our next meeting as a Halloween meeting in about a month, everyone come in costume. Cassandra, I'm not saying what you're wearing is a costume, but you could.
Does this count? Or could I, maybe I could just wear workout clothes. That could be my
It does count, but I was thinking you and Pat McGuff could switch outfits.
Okay, I'm in. Totally
Yeah,
in.
okay.
Actually, I've always wanted the uniform, so.
It makes getting ready far more efficient.
But I get the engine.
Oh, you want the mechanics.
Yeah.
I have my TVF&R uniform right here, so I'm all set.
Nice.
John, let me do a timeline reality check with everybody.
Yeah.
We've been on a really tight timeline anyway. That's why we've had a meeting every week. If we take a month off, and I'm not saying we shouldn't, I'm just doing a reality check, we will not get this adopted by the end of the year. Because we have to go through an agency, a planning commission, a county briefing, a city council hearing, and a 45-day consult and confer. When I was working with Nick on financials today, we were going back and forth on what the start date would be. And he told me that if indeed you didn't start your first TIF collections till next year, that actually gives you a little more money because your final year will have more money. So if you're doing 30 years, this year will pick up the October collections. So although you won't start getting money early, we all know that in those first 5 years, you're getting virtually nothing anyway. But you'll end up getting more overall if we delay the adoption until after the January meeting. So, John, I just want to say I think it's fine to do that 1 month delay, and we can keep on the schedule to keep momentum, and still get it adopted so that you're in the time period to get the assessed value rolls, because that would either have been October in 10 days, which we know we won't meet, or it will be October of next year. But it would mean your first year TIF is a year late, but you'd actually get more money overall.
Okay, that's helpful. And as always, I'm duty bound to say, should the council adopt?
Yes.
So that's great. With that in mind, I think it makes a ton of sense. We want you all to have the time, but what I would ask is, so if we're looking, maybe we could look at a Tuesday, like Tuesday, the 18th of October, for example. If that gives everyone the time to meet with your group and come back with what we need, I would love to help you support that. And if any of you need me or Darren or Elaine or Nick to provide information in a way that makes sense for your groups, please contact us. I can come to neighborhood meetings and help explain. I already have 1 or 2 on my calendar. I'm happy to do this, or come to whatever board you're part of.
I can put together a packet of.
That would be really super helpful. I was going to ask for that after the meeting, but that's great. Thank you, Elaine. But I guess the request would be, if you can do everything you can to come back at the next meeting ready to go. And we can even, I think Elaine and I and Darren can even sort of write out the questions maybe. Here's the things that are talked about. Here's some specific pieces of advice that would be incredibly useful, which would have to do with project boundary, although we already voted on that. Project priorities, we can point you to that in a packet. And some of these other questions you've asked about. So that would be incredibly helpful to us and to the council. Can we possibly tentatively reserve October 18th at 3 to 5?
That works for me.
Lynn will be back by then, so Ben won't have to run the meeting.
He's done a great job.
No, I agree. Okay. So in the next day or two, send us any information requests you have. And send me, Darren, and Elaine any meeting dates that you really need us to be at. And we'll try to work something out. Okay.
But was there any public, is there anybody from the general public listening in?
Thank you for asking that. Ben, is there anyone on the line who's not a member of the group? Do you know? Or Darren?
To my knowledge, looking through the list right now, I don't believe so.
List on the right, I don't see anyone.
The other thing that we had talked about adding, and I know we have 5 minutes, so we aren't going to jump into any discussions, but we will kind of keep this on the table, is looking at DEI considerations and recommendations. And so we aren't going to lose that. We'll keep that together. And I see there's another hand from Mr. Edwards.
Well, since I'm a citizen at large, I don't represent any group unless I represent everybody that's not a part of a group. I don't know what position that puts me in. Although I want to blame John for inviting me and causing all the trouble that I've caused.
I regret it immensely by now, so thank you for acknowledging that. No, not at all. There's several of you that are, we appreciate your expertise and the perspective you're bringing to this, and you all are more than just your positions too. You know, we have residents who are business owners and have that perspective. We have neighborhood association presidents who are also on volunteer committees. So you're all representing more than just your spot, and we appreciate that. So Jim, you can go spend the next month with yourself and come back with some better comments.
Okay.
All right, anything else, Elaine? Are we good?
I think we've done a great job, and I appreciate all the input.
Me too, me too. Thank you all for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.